Before you click off, no, I'm not some leftist. I don't have a membership card for the socialist alternative, and I'm not even going to argue that Chavez was good. I'd actually like to consider myself as somewhat ideologically neutral when it comes to governance. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea. Who cares if it comes from the left or the right, so to speak. As a history teacher though, I do have issues with guys like Steven Crowder. Not because he's right-wing, there's plenty of mad right-wing commentary when it comes to history, but because he makes things dangerously oversimplified and many of his talking points actually prevent people from engaging in history with nuance.
You can call it democratic socialism, you can call it national socialism. There is no good socialism. That's the only constant, and it always results in mismanagement.
In today's episode of Enemies of the West, we're going to be covering Venezuela's leader of the early 21st century, Hugo Chavez. And as a history teacher, my main aim for the video is that in less than 10 minutes, you'll walk away knowing what actually happened in Venezuela during the first decade of the 2000s, rather than just socialism bad. Let's get into it.
Hello there.
Okay, so as we look at the regime of Hugo Chavez, we'll be doing so in response to this 2018 video made by Steven Crowder, which itself was in response to John Oliver's video on Venezuela.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them.
Crowder's basic claim is that as an ideology, socialism was responsible for the downfall of Venezuela. And for the viewer, simple explanations like this are enticing because it exonerates them from having to do their own research, because they already know the answer.
The left is always wrong. And I'm saying that in absolutist, yes, absolutely, as it relates to socialism, and no one calls them on it. I am amazed.
Just like with Cuba, the Soviet Union, and North Korea, Venezuela simply failed because of communism. And any attempt to show any other nuance is strawman to be the, well, that wasn't true communism argument.
For a start, they didn't do it properly. They ignored it.
That's what everybody says, but no one's ever done it properly.
Another key issue is that the term socialism is used so differently across the board that it's pretty much pointless to use. Here's a spectrum from no government regulation of the economy to complete government regulation of the economy, and pretty much most of the spectrum could be described as socialist depending on whose point of view you come from. I imagine that Crowder would reply that socialism is just shorthand to refer to a country on the left end of the spectrum. But if that is the case, then could I not make the simple argument that the Great Depression happened in a capitalist country, and so therefore America was in a mess in the 1930s because of capitalism itself? There's obviously some leaps of logic in that line of argument and a lot of gaps that need to be filled in, so let's not waste any more time and actually get to Chavez. In his video, Crowder makes the argument that due to its rich oil reserves, when Chavez came to power in 1999, Venezuela was in good economic shape.
Hey, now you're taking a big if with countries that aren't rich in oil. They were starting off halfway through the foot race as far as a head start. All Venezuela had to do was not fumble.
But that just isn't quite true.
God, no, that doesn't matter. This is so cool.
In the 1980s, like other oil-rich companies, Venezuela had to endure the 1980s oil glut. The fall in global oil prices due to oversupply meant that from 1985 to 1990, the USA reduced its imports of Venezuelan oil from 550,000 tons to 110,000 tons. Not to mention that the Venezuelan government had taken on crippling debt in the 1990s, and prior to Chavez, the Venezuelan government had recognized the need to diversify the economy into gold and diamond, but were unsuccessful in doing so. So in 1999, Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez as their leader, and as a charismatic and relatively young soldier, Chavez had attempted a coup earlier in 1992, though this was unsuccessful. In fairness to Crowder, Chavez was the leader of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, and was openly influenced by Karl Marx and Che Guevara. So he wasn't exactly a closet fan of the more communist school of thought.
What? No!
Immediately, Chavez put a referendum to the Venezuelan public over a new constitution. The masses were largely supportive, and Chavez's circle wrote a new constitution that greatly expanded the rights citizens had, such as the right to education, healthcare, and the right to practice your own culture. However, many in parliament were annoyed that they lost the right to impeach the president, and Chavez started to lose support from within the government.
He has control of the Senate and the courts. He's too dangerous to be left alive.
When it came to policy, Chavez's most famous were his series of Bolivar Missions. Basically, Chavez used the oil money to fund a whole range of social programs, a move which moves Crowder to quote, freedom-loving disgust.
Think about it. The words, government took control, the state took control of oil companies, then fired executives, can only generate one of two visceral reactions. Disgust, freedom-loving disgust.
However, an important bit of context to this is that he was nationalizing oil fields used heavily by US oil companies, mainly ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. Quite simply, Chavez wanted Venezuelan people rather than American companies to reap the benefits of Venezuelan resources. But we'll come back to this later because I'm not singing Chavez's praise on all things here. The Bolivarian Missions aim to target many facets of Venezuelan society, including poverty, housing, culture, and education. If you have a look at this graph, it had a pretty immediate effect on Venezuela's poverty rates, but in Crowder's video, he does actually address this.
All of the monies and all of the things, and you know what? You could also completely eliminate unemployment if you forced everyone to dig ditches with spoons.
You could.
It doesn't mean it's a real economy.
Yeah, that's a bad
It gets propped up. North Korea did the same thing. Forced labor only works for so long before you fall off the edge.
Now, I get Crowder's argument here that if you just throw resources at something, it will always work in the short term, but never the long term. But let's go back to that poverty data. It has stayed low since its initial drop. And there was much more nuance to the Bolivarian missions than Crowder gives them credit for. It wasn't just throwing money at poor people, but giving them the tools to leave poverty permanently. For example, Mission Sucre provided free tertiary education to adults. And no, it wasn't government funding for, say, Cambodian dance theory. It was in areas like teaching, law, communication, civil engineering, mining, geology, and so on. In Chavez's lifetime, Mission Sucre was responsible for 2 million adults taking tertiary study and 695,000 graduations. Mission Robinson also increased the literacy rate across Venezuela. Chavez probably exaggerated by saying it was at 99%, but UNESCO still recognized improvement at 95.2%. In terms of health, Mission Barrio Adrento saw infant mortality drop from 23 to 20 in males and 19 to 17 in females per 1,000 births between 2003 and 2005. And between 2004 and 2005, medical consultations increased fourfold. There were many more missions, and they weren't without their issues as the murder rate rapidly increased too. Nonetheless, it is important to address the more hardline nature of the Chavez regime and the fact that he theatrically fired oil executives.
Think about it. The words, government took control, the state took control of oil companies, then fired executives, can only generate one of two visceral reactions. Disgust, freedom-loving disgust.
And to be honest, there's a lot that I can agree with Crowder on here. The repression of free speech doesn't help any society prosper, and Chavez's record is far from unblemished, especially after calling for the 30-year imprisonment of a judge who gave conditional bail to a government critic who had been in prison for 3 years. And yeah, the firing of the national oil companies execs rid the industry of any expertise and wasn't wise policy. But again, there's important context that helps us understand the situation. In 2002, Pedro Carmona led a successful coup against the Chavez government, which lasted for 36 hours before angry crowds in the military ousted Carmona. But interestingly, America unquestionably knew about the coup, and there's some evidence to suggest that they helped orchestrate it. Chavez had criticized Bush's invasion of Iraq, had undermined America's trade embargo to Cuba by supplying them with oil, and ended American companies' gravy train by nationalizing the oil fields. Declassified CIA documents show that the CIA knew a coup was going to happen sometime in April, a week before it actually happened. Now, Bush didn't share any of this information with Chavez. Also, Otto Reich, who was Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, housed the leaders of the coup prior to April 2002, and once the coup took place, he spoke to all the ambassadors of other Latin American countries hours afterwards, telling them that Chavez had resigned and asked them to support the new government. Not to mention that in August of 2006, the Bush administration created the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program, specifically targeting Cuban medical personnel and encouraging them to defect when working in a country outside of Cuba. As Venezuela had many Cuban medical professionals, this was a not-so-subtle attempt at undermining the Chavez regime. So yes, in isolation, Crowder's statements here make perfect sense.
On economic policy, that is evil. You see the results time after time after time after time, and you'd think they'd have egg on their face because they praised people who were evil in Castro, in people like Chavez.
However, Chavez had good reason to be paranoid about foreign interference.
No.
And lived in a state of fear that the Carmona Coup would repeat itself once again. I agree that the repression of free speech is not the solution, but it is easy to talk about the need for free speech when you're the nation who's destabilized other governments, rather than being the ones who are being destabilized. Chavez died in office in 2013 and was succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, and I'm going to see where the cookie crumbles on this one before making a video on him. I really don't have much of an opinion on Chavez himself, and let's be honest, an 8-minute video barely scratches the surface of his regime, but when thinking historically, it's so important to judge each policy by its own merits and to avoid the tempting lazy arguments of socialism bad or capitalism bad. By looking at labels rather than policies, history can be marketed to our existing political persuasion, and that's where history becomes an incredible propaganda tool. Studying modern history ought to make us propaganda-proof, and not tools of the propaganda model. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe for plenty of other enemies of the West and for our History of Modern China series. We can't wait to see you next time for our next venture into a fascinating part of history.